Welcome to the AUA's all-new monthly podcast series that focuses on leadership and business topics relevant to the entire urologic care team. Please join us each month on the Inside Tract as our subject matter experts explore various aspects of today's rapidly changing business environment. In this episode, Dr. Norm Smith joins host Dr. Jennifer Miles Thomas as they delve into the topic of relative value unit and its importance in both reimbursement and physician compensation.
Welcome to the AUA Inside Tract podcast as we continue with our new podcast series focused on leadership and business topics, and more specifically, the financial management aspects of clinical practice. Today, we will be discussing the RVU, the relative value unit, and its importance in both reimbursement and physician compensation. To help us dive deep into this important and really relevant topic, I'm happy to have with me today Dr. Norm Smith. Dr. Smith is the Chief of Urologic Oncology, Clinical Trials, and Program Development for North Shore University Health System in Chicago, Illinois. He presently serves as the AUA Public Policy Council as the RUC member. In addition, he was selected for participation in the AUA Leadership Program, class of 2010 to 2011, and as the AUA Gallagher Health Policy Scholar in 2015. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Happy to be here, Dr. Miles Thomas, and thank you for the kind introduction. I really would like to thank you and the AUA for the opportunity to discuss what I feel to be a very important topic in the world of urology, basically the RVU.
Well, thank you. We are happy that you're able to share your insights and information and just help educate us on what's going on with RVU. What does it mean? So if we're going to set the stage for this discussion, can you provide our listeners with just kind of an overview of RVS? What does that mean? And RVUs? Can you just explain what those letters mean?
Yes, sure. So RVS stands for the Resource-Based Relative Value Scale. And this is really the payment system for physician services in the United States. This started in 1985 as a government initiative under President Ronald Reagan and was known then as the Harvard Study. It was signed into law by George Bush the Senior in 1989, and the RVRVS was enacted by Medicare in 1992 under authority of CMS as the payment for physician services in the United States. And the real basic tenet of RVRVS is that physician payments are based on resource costs to provide service. They're not based on physician charges for service, which was the case before RVRVS. And if you look at total resource costs as a pie, if you will, there are three components to that pie. One is physician work RVU, that's about 48%. Practice expense is about 48%, and professional liability insurance is roughly 4%. To break each of those down slightly, physician work takes into account many factors, including time required, technical skill, judgment, effort, and stress. But by far the most important of those concerning RVU is time required. Practice expense includes clinical staff time, nurses, MAs, schedulers, etc., as well as medical supplies and equipment. Professional liability insurance is pretty self-explanatory, but of these three components of the pie, all of them were resource-based under the authority of CMS by 2002. So that's a bit of background as to RVRVS and what are the components of an RVU.
Well, thank you. That was very helpful, just explaining the background so we have a good understanding of what that means. So what's the actual process for determining the appropriate value or the RVU of a physician's work? There's many different services performed. What's the process for that?
So this really falls under the auspices of the RUC, which stands for Relative Value System Update Committee. And to go a bit into the background of the RUC and how RVUs are determined, the RUC was formed by the AMA in 1991, and it involves the AMA and various specialty societies. And the charge of the RUC is to act as an independent expert panel to determine value of physician work, practice expense, and PLI, and submit these annual RVU update recommendations to CMS. So there are 28 voting members of the RUC involving both medical and surgical subspecialties. Obviously, urology is one, but a 2/3 vote is required for a value to pass and to be able to be submitted to CMS. So the RUC is a very complicated process where really every CPT code that comes to the RUC is evaluated for physician work RVU, practice expense RVU, key reference services or comparator services. We do review utilization data as well as potential modifier applications, which generally means an analysis is an E&M code typically performed on same date of service. So the CMS historically adopts about 80% of RUC recommendations, but this number is falling and sadly I think will continue to fall. And ultimately it is CMS's call about not only the RVUs, but they also set wages, equipment, and supply cost. So the analogy for the RUC, the best one I can come up with is sort of akin to a judicial process, where the judge of this process is the chair of the RUC and AMA leadership. The plaintiff, if you will, is the specialty society. So when the AUA has codes to present, there's an AUA RUC advisory team that presents data from member surveys, gives recommendations to the RUC, but then the RUC members are really the jury and sort of defense counsel rolled into one. And what I mean by that, the RUC members' job is sort of defend fairness of the system to make sure that all codes are sort of treated equally and fairly, but they're jury in that they also vote on the codes. So AUA would present, the RUC members would vote. If 2/3 vote passes, then RUC recommendations are sent to CMS. The last thing I'll mention about RUC process is, well, what if you don't agree? What if the AUA presents a code, the RUC decides one thing or another, CMS makes a final call that the AUA doesn't agree with? There is a RUC appeals process through CMS. The caveat of the appeals process, though, is by definition, you're supposed to present data that's new or wasn't available at the time of RUC review. So as an example, the last time this happened regarding the AUA was that the code for robot prostatectomy went through the RUC, and CMS didn't agree with RUC recommendations and unilaterally cut the value by more than 1/3. Obviously, the AUA didn't agree with that and went through the appeals process, which is presentation of data to a panel at CMS, and ultimately RUC recommendations were restored. But that's sort of an overview of RUC process and RUC appeals process.
Well, that also makes sense, but is there a process if things change quickly? So there's a normal cadence of RUC review, but what happens if something changes significantly in the landscape of medicine? Would an individual be able to contact someone and have an early review of a code or a supply cost?
That does happen. And the way it happens most commonly is through new codes that go through CPT. So examples would be robot technology advances, and the AUA decides that they'd like a code for robotic simple prostatectomy as example, or MRI fusion biopsy. So rapid changes in new technology typically go through CPT with creation of new codes. And then when that's done, whole families of codes come back to the RUC for evaluation. Another built-in process through the RUC is new technology. So any sort of new service, it's automatically flagged to be re-reviewed in 3 years' time when utilization data is available.
Okay. Well, that's good to know also. So it's not just the one code that's reviewed, the family is reviewed at the same time?
Correct.
Okay.
Because we always talk about relativity and not wanting to create rank order anomalies within a family. So as an example, a robot prostatectomy with lymph node dissection should have more value than a robot prostatectomy alone. And if that's not the case, then there's rank order anomaly. So whole families are evaluated, yes.
Okay. I understand that now. So thank you. So if we kind of switch gears, what's the best way for physicians like myself to transition thinking from an RVU to an actual payment for service?
Yes, so this is complicated, but to walk you through it, we talked about that the first step is that an RVU through the RUC is assigned to all three components of that total resource cost pie. So an RVU is assigned to physician work RVU, to practice expense, and to professional liability insurance. Then that sum is multiplied by geographic practice cost index, the tenet being it costs different money to practice in different areas of the country. So the GPCI is different based on region of the country. Then you take that product and it's multiplied by the dollar amount of the conversion factor. And the conversion factor is not a well-known, but an extraordinarily important aspect of this process. And the reason is I think it's the main tool that CMS uses to assure budget neutrality. So the whole RBRVS, no new money flows into that system. So if one code goes up, another code has to go down, and CMS uses the conversion factor to do so. So when you multiply by the conversion factor, it sets the dollar for every CPT code. But as an example of how this can fluctuate, CMS resets the conversion factor every year. So last year, you might remember E&M codes were evaluated at the RUC and their value went up. Because there's so many millions of E&M codes, if their value is going up, the conversion factor goes significantly down to offset that cost. So actually, it went down so much that multiple stakeholders went to the Hill, and Congress actually mitigated much of the decrease in this year's conversion factor to try to protect medical specialties in this time of COVID and other challenges. But that's really how you go from an RVU value through the RUC. You use the GPCI based on region of the country. Then you multiply by the conversion factor that's set by CMS and changed every year. And that gives you the dollar figure for every CPT code.
Well, it seems like it's very data driven and very data based. Just as an aside, occasionally members of the AUA receive an email asking them to complete RUC surveys. So what you're telling me, it's very important that we all complete these surveys because they're using that data for the future.
Yeah, so the whole basis of RUC review comes from real survey data from members. So if a code that's a urology code is going to come before the RUC, member surveys are sent out randomly. It's typically to 6,000 or so urologists. And the key is that urologists think of their typical patient. They don't think of the fastest they've ever done it. They don't think of the slowest they've ever done it. But on average, how long does it take you to do procedure X? So sort of answering honestly and accurately drives the data that's presented to the RUC and ultimately the RVU that comes out of the RUC. So member surveys are extremely important to the process.
Well, that's great to know. So a lot of physicians are aware of RVUs and understand that because it affects compensation. So can you kind of expand on what RVU-based physician models could look like? Like, how do they work?
Yes, so there are many, many different RVU compensation models, but I'd like to go through a few of the most common. One would be simply compensation per work RVU. And this is a set dollar amount for every RVU that you produce. In the field of urology, it's generally about $50 to $55 per RVU. So an example would be you do 10,000 RVUs, $50 per RVU, you get paid 500,000. So that's straight up compensation per work RVU example. A second is a graduated payment scale where the dollar conversion rate changes as the RVU range changes. And something like this might look like, well, for the first 5,000 RVUs, you make $40 an RVU. From 5,000 to 7,000, you might make 50, and over 7,000, 65 as an example. But that's a graduated payment scale. And then the third most common, and probably the most common overall, is base plus productivity. And this is really what it sounds, is that a urologist would have a guaranteed base salary with then incentive productivity bonus for every RVU that's generated above a threshold. And an example of this might be, well, you get paid $300,000 for 5,000 RVUs, and then every RVU that you do above 5,000, you get a productivity bonus of $55 per RVU, something like that. So those are the three most common RVU compensation models, but the basic tenet of all three of them is to align compensation to productivity. But I think it's very important for urologists to understand that this is only measured by the work RVU. And we talked about that. The work RVU is 48 cents on the dollar, or 48% of the total pie. So keep in mind that 52% or 52 cents on the dollar is going to somebody else. This process of using RVU for compensation utilizes various independent compensation surveys. The most common are Sullivan-Cotter, MGMA, and AMGA. The basic tenet of all of those are as your RVU goes up from 10th percentile to, say, 90th percentile, your compensation is linked to that and goes up as well. It's important to understand, though, that Sullivan-Cotter, MGMA, and the AMGA, there are differences in them. So it's certainly a urologist should understand what they're based upon. And many large healthcare systems are going to models that account for all three, since there's differences. So those are the most common and sort of tenets of RVU-based compensation.
So it seems that urologists should pay attention to what the average RVU value is overall per RVU for a urologist, so that if they're negotiating any compensation model, they would have an idea of what the range is and really understand. So it makes sense. It makes everything much more data driven than emotionally driven. And it's not saying the value of the urologist, it's saying the value of the work that's being performed, which makes sense.
Yeah, and it's not so easy to come by that data or get your hands on it if you're an individual urologist. But just to speak broadly of ranges based on Sullivan-Cotter and the various surveys, in general, median RVUs for urologists based on 2019 data are somewhere in the 7,500 to 8,000 RVU range. So that's what you're looking at, obviously a little bit pre-COVID, but that is the general range for median RVU. And then compensation is generally in a range of 450 to 520,000, with differences amongst surveys. but that's a general range that urologists can look at for both median RVU and median compensation.
Well, I think that's very helpful for many people, just to get an understanding. So, what take-home messages would you have for our listeners today? Understanding the RVUs, the importance of the surveys, reimbursement, compensation. Any take-home messages you would like to share?
Yes, I think that my main take-home messages to urologists would be that the RUC process is very complicated, but it's extremely critical to the field of urology. And robust AUA survey responses are the best way to drive accurate data and a fair RVU valuation. The AUA has been trying to message this for some time, and I will say I think that we're gaining some traction, is that the RUC meeting is actually this week, and the urology codes being presented have the highest response rates that I've ever seen in my time on the RUC. So shout out to our members, but AUA surveys are critical. The second is that, again, RVUs were never developed or intended to be linked to physician compensation. They were developed to be linked to payment for services, but keep in mind, once again, work RVU is the only thing we're judged on, and that's 48 cents on the dollar. 52 cents is going to somebody else, and I think that we have to keep that in mind. Again, MGMA, AMGA, and Sullivan-Cotter have different RVU and compensation figures. So mixed models are probably the way of the future, and you certainly should know what model you're being judged by. And then, my final would be that RVU compensation-based models are probably the least urologist-friendly. And I think as a specialty, we need to be creative in how do we obviously legally and fairly dip into some of that downstream revenue of the 52 cents that are going elsewhere. So those are my main take-home messages.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Thank you very much for clarifying a lot of the acronyms that we typically hear, but really don't always understand. You've made it fairly straightforward to understand the process and truly how we come up with the value of our work. Thank you very much for explaining how the reimbursement works, and also how that's used currently and for physician compensation, and how maybe we could access some of that information. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning into this very important and very relevant topic with us. To listen to additional podcasts in this series that focus on the financial management aspects of clinical practice, please visit the AUA Inside Track at auanet.org/podcast. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you for listening. For additional episodes in this podcast series, please visit the AUA Inside Tract podcast at auanet.org/podcast. If you have any research focused on leadership, business, or practice management, please consider submitting your article to AUA's peer-reviewed journal, Urology Practice. For instructions for submission, please see auajournals.org and click on Urology Practice. This journal publishes cutting-edge articles on clinical trends, challenges, and practice applications in the 4 areas of business, health policy, the specialty, and patient care.